Michael Moran was, in every sense, a product of Royal Dublin. From his earliest days, the site most familiar to him was the rugged linksland of Dollymount, where he would later perfect the splendid golfing skills that were to make him the first truly great Irish professional and one of the finest players of his generation. In a life spanning a tragically brief 31 years, Moran's greatest achievements were 5 successive triumphs in the Irish Professional Championship, which has yet to be equalled, and a third-place finish in the British Open of 1913, behind the illustrious J.H. Taylor at Hoylake. This famous venue was to become particularly significant in the history of professional golf in Ireland, for it was there in 1947 that Fred Daly became the first Irishman to capture the game's most coveted title. The members of the newly founded Dublin Golf Club were pursuing their favourite pastime at their original home in the Phoenix Park when Michael Moran was born in 1886 in a modest little cottage situated in the centre of the North Bull at Dollymount. His family had lived there for several generations, close by a famous landmark known as Curly's Hole. Later, the ruins of the Moran home became known as Curly's Yard. Curly's Yard is still used by the greenkeeping team at Royal Dublin to this day. Curly's Yard was named after Moran's maternal grandfather, Patrick Curly, who was something of a character in the area, even to the point of being accorded celebrity status. Interestingly, during his formative years as a caddy and golfer on the Dollymount links, Moran was known as Curly. The more famous appendage of Dyke was to come some years later. There is some doubt as to how the nickname of Dyke came about. The common belief is that it referred to his penchant for reducing a hole to 1 under par, a birdie in modern golfing parlance. Another theory is that it was a descriptive term from the Royal Dublin members for a diminutive athletic figure who was to be seen bounding over the many dykes and drains on the links as he made his way, presumably in the early morning, from his cottage to the clubhouse. Either way, the established members of the club considered Curly to be a highly appropriate name for a youngster who had a happy, cheery disposition for which he was well liked. One such member was Cecil Barcroft, who was captain of the club in 1901 and was later to become the first secretary-manager of the club. A keen student of golf and a useful player, Barcroft took a particular interest in Moran, recognising his splendid talent. Indeed, so as to encourage the youngster to achieve a keen competitive edge, Barcroft and a scratchman by the name of Gerald Dunn would have Moran play their better ball in challenge matches. Only once did we get the better of him, and in that round our better ball was, by great luck, the absolute par of the green, wrote Barcroft. Destined for a professional career, Moran was 20 when he gained his first appointment at Dundalk. The time of the appointment was unfortunate, however, in that it coincided with major greenkeeping problems there, and by June 1907 he was appointed as assistant to Tom Hood at Dollymount. A month later, the Irish correspondent of Golf Illustrated magazine reported, "I am confident that Moran is one of the most consistently brilliant players I have seen on the Royal Dublin course." Nobody knew Moran's game, however, better than Barcroft did. In a 1909 issue of The World of Golf, he wrote, "He has youth, power, and very considerable science at his command." His driving, which is quite long enough for first-class golf, is, I think, the weakest part of his game. For though he can drive finely, he can pull wickedly when the wind is from the right. Not content with a fair ball under such conditions, he is apt to go for a big pull, and often gets an abnormal one. This fault let him down in some crucial matches. The rest of his game is very fine, gifted with a great variety of shots. There is one which is especially good, the low half-iron shot held up to a left-hand headwind. Of short pitch and run shots he is a master, probably because his early golf was played on a course where greens are small. His putting is bold and sound, the putter finishing well through, a rare thing amongst professionals. Generally speaking, his style is peculiar, swaying the body greatly in addressing the ball. Most people think he sways his body when striking the ball. This, I think, is not so, but the point could only be decided by a cinematograph. His swing is very flat and fairly long. Barcroft concluded, "It is a great pleasure to one for whom, in the old days at Dollymount, Curly has caddied frequently, to chronicle the success of a young and promising player, possessed of great golfing talent, a modest victor and a cheerful loser." Having become established in his new role at Royal Dublin, Moran decided to compete in the Irish Professional Championship, which had been instituted by the Golfing Union of Ireland in 1907, with a match play format, preceded by stroke play qualifying. It was won in 1907 and 1908 by James Edmondson, a native of Portrush, who triumphed in the inaugural event over his home course and then at Portmarnock. The championship of 1909 was scheduled for the Royal County Down Links at Newcastle, a course that Moran had never played. Aware of this handicap, he concentrated on thorough preparation for the event through a series of challenge matches. Notable amongst these was a 2-hole defeat of the Skerries professional Cahill and a halved match with Edmondson. Against the champion, Moran looked to be set for a comfortable win, but eventually had to hole a useful putt on the last green to avoid defeat. In the stroke play qualifying on a wild, difficult day at Newcastle, Moran tied with Edmondson on 167, rounds of 84 and 83. Then, in the match play stages, he bettered Smith by 5 and 4 in the semi-finals and went on to capture the title by crushing H. Kidd by 9 and 7 in the final. Over the first 18 holes, Moran had come from 3 down to be 2 up at lunchtime, and he went on to overwhelm his opponent in the afternoon. Then, to embellish his victory, Moran went on to thrash Lionel Munn by 6 and 5 in the traditional match between the native professional and the Irish Amateur Open champion. Ironically, Munn was a member of Royal Dublin at that stage and had won the close championship of 1908. In defending the title a year later at Royal Dublin, Moran produced arguably his finest stroke play performance. Prior to the staging of the Professional Championship of 1910, Royal Dublin had been going through a period of major change. In the days of the gutty ball, it had been considered a searching test because of the tightness of the lies, but the emergence of the rubber cord wound ball demanded major modifications to the links. 77 new bunkers were constructed, and several new holes were made, resulting in a significant improvement overall. At that stage, the Dollymount links measured about 100 yards shorter than St Andrews, Hoylake and Royal Cinqueport, and it was considerably longer than Prestwick and Muirfield. Its challenge was heightened by small and closely guarded greens. Before the opening of the new holes, the course record was a 74 shot by Fred Smith. Over the changed course, however, the best score prior to the Professional Championship of 1910 was a 76, recorded by Munn in the university's competition. Munn's record stood after the first round of the championship, in which Moran was one of the 3 players to tie in 78. The local favourite followed this, however, with a splendid second round of 72, a new course record. Even better was to come on the following morning when Moran produced a superb exhibition to follow an outward 36 with an inward 34 for a round of 70. According to reports, the score could have been better, but for a bad kick which deflected his approach shot to the last, right of the green. A final round of 76 gained Moran an aggregate of 276 and victory by 10 strokes. The quality of his performance could be gauged from the fact that his aggregate was not beaten by a domestic event at Royal Dublin until Christy O'Connor won the championship with a 4-round total of 286 in 1978. From then on, Moran reigned supreme in Irish golf, winning the national crown for a third successive time at Royal Portrush with an aggregate of 310 shots in 1911. He then captured a fourth title at Castle Rock in 1912 and completed 5 in a row with a winning aggregate of 324 shots in wretched conditions at Portmarnock in 1913. Meanwhile, Moran had also gained the opportunity of matching his skills with the leading players of the period. On Saturday, September the 18th, 1909, he played a 36-hole challenge match against Harry Varden at Delgany, where a large crowd gathered, some having travelled by train from Dublin to Greystones, and others having come by horse and carriage. By his own admission, Varden drove like a lion but put it like a lamb. Still, the Channel Islander did sufficient to beat Moran by 3-2 in a match that would take on a fresh significance at Hoylake 4 years later. Another important event for Moran during this period was the coronation match of 1911, in which he acquitted himself admirably. All of this experience was to become crucial when the Royal Dublin man challenged for the British Open at the Royal Liverpool Golf Club at Hoylake in June 1913. The original entry of 269 golfers was reduced to 65 by 36 holes qualifying, and when the championship got underway, Moran was well in contention after an opening round of 76. In the afternoon, knowledgeable heads began to turn as word filtered through of some splendid play on the homeward journey by the little-known Irishman. With superb figures of 3-4, 3-2 from the 10th to the 13th, Moran was challenging strongly for the lead, but his inward 33 for a 36-hole total of 150 left him in third place, 3 strokes behind the leader, Ted Ray, and 2 behind the redoubtable J.H. Taylor. A major shock had been the failure of George Duncan to come through the qualifying. It can be assumed that the 26-year-old Irishman had a rather fitful night, given his position ahead of such legends as Sandy Hurd, Varden, and indeed James Braid. Either way, a disastrous start to the third round was to wreck his hopes of ultimate success. Those familiar with Moran's game would have reflected knowingly on the assessment of Cecil Barcroft, given the way that the Irish challenger played Hoylake's treacherous opening hole. The old pull which Barcroft wrote of was in evidence when, in a horrendous gale, Moran's opening tee shot was badly offline. Worse was to follow, however, when he hooked his second out of bounds. Having reloaded, he was in a bunker short of the green in 4, but took a wretched 4 more strokes to extricate the ball from the trap, and with 2 putts, ran up a miserable 10. Further bunker problems were to follow at the long third, where he found a greenside trap off a cleek approach, and 3 putts led to a 7. Given such a discouraging start and an outward 9 of 48, he did remarkably well to hold his nerves for a round of 89, which, though it virtually put him out of contention, still kept him in line for a high finish in the leaderboard. Writing in the London Times, Bernard Darwin was rather critical of Moran's early collapse. Moran very quickly fulfilled my prophecy as to his Celtic temperament, he wrote. If he had played the first hole with discretion, he could still have holed out in 7. But in his impetuosity, he went for the green, and this sealed his fate. Still, there was sufficient time to repair some of the damage. Though high winds persisted in the afternoon, the rain stopped and Moran set off with an exemplary 5 at the first and had another 5 at the third, covering these 2 holes in 7 strokes fewer than he had taken in the morning. The turn was reached in 39, and despite the testing conditions, he continued to keep a 6 off his card, returning a splendid 74 for an aggregate of 3-1-3. It was sufficient to give him a tie for third place with Varden, 9 strokes behind the winner Taylor, who had rounds of 73, 75, 77 and 79 for an aggregate of 304. Taylor won by a crushing 8 strokes from Ray in second position. So it is remarkable to assume that if Moran had carded a 7 at the opening hole that morning rather than a 10, he would have been runner-up. On his overall performance, Darwin wrote, Moran's performance of going round 74 strokes after his most ruinous start of the morning was really a splendid one. At present, he seems fated to have one bad round. Until he is a little more master of himself, he probably always will. If he could only school himself to take things rather more quietly, he might easily win, for he has grand golf in him. Earning £12 10 shillings, Moran had become the first Irish golfer to claim a prize in the British Open. His back nine of 33 in the second round was the lowest of the championship, and his final round of 74 was the best of the afternoon. As it happened, his only other challenge for the British Open was at Prestwick in 1914, when rounds of 82, 83, 82 and 76 for an aggregate of 323 left him in a tie for 25th place, 17 strokes behind the winner Varden, who beat Taylor into second place by 3 strokes. By 1914, Moran had left Royal Dublin to become professional at Seaham Harbour Golf Club, which had been founded in 1911, 6 miles south of Sunderland in the northeast of England. A year later, he returned to Ireland and won a Red Cross medal in a tournament at Rathfarnham. He then answered the call to battle in the First World War during the South Irish Horse Regiment. Sadly, the outbreak of the war also meant the closure of his beloved Royal Dublin, which was turned into a musketry range. So it was at Clontarf where Moran played his last round of golf in Ireland in 1917. He was home on furlough at the time and played with a few odd clubs that the local members had scrapped together for the occasion. Indeed, in the 4-ball event, Moran was actually attired in his ammunition boots as he negotiated the 9 holes at Mount Temple in the remarkable score of 32 strokes. According to one observer, his golf that day was the best we ever saw him play, in championship or otherwise. Shortly afterwards, he returned to France, and it was our sad task to write the obituary of the greatest golfer his country has so far produced. During the desperate spring offensive by the Germans in 1918, Moran was mortally wounded in battle, and he died on April 10th in the war hospital of Le Cateau, which was at that time in enemy hands. He had transferred to the Royal Irish Regiment while in France, and his death was not reported until after the end of hostilities in December 1918. 8 years previously, his friend and mentor Cecil Barcroft had written the prophetic words, "He has a determination to fight to the bitter end, no matter how cruel the fates be." The fates were indeed cruel to Michael Moran, who, like thousands of other young men of that time, became involved in the bloodiest conflict in history. It was a long way from those free-spirited days on the Dollymount links, where he had chased hares and uncovered the odd stray golf ball, which would be stored away for the quiet practice sessions that would shape a brilliant career. War and an enemy shell were to ensure that Michael Moran should never reach his full potential. Perhaps the cruelest irony of all was that he died at an age when all of the game's great players are only approaching their prime.